Well, the House of Commons today debated an NDP motion which calls on the federal government to decriminalize the possession of marijuana before it is legalized. The Liberals have promised to introduce legislation early next year to legalize pot while regulating its sale and restricting its access. But in the meantime, the simple possession of marijuana remains a criminal offence. Here's the NDP leader calling on the Justice Minister to take immediate action to prevent anyone else from being charged with simple possession.
Now, the government has just created massive confusion in the justice system. Judges are calling the situation absurd. While the government is talking legalization, the courts are being forced to convict. Even the Conservative Party now calls for marijuana possession to be removed from the criminal code. The Conservative Party. Why will this Liberal government continue to hand out criminal records to tens of thousands of mostly young Canadians instead of decriminalizing marijuana now?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
We're committed to legalization, strict regulation of marijuana. Simply decriminalizing will not achieve the objectives of keeping it out of the hands of children and the proceeds out of the hands of criminals. We have committed to introduce legislation in the spring of 2017. In that intervening period, we will engage with experts in the health area, public safety, justice, and law enforcement to ensure that we proceed in an orderly manner that will achieve the objectives that we are committed to achieving.
So, should the government move now to decriminalize marijuana possession ahead of legalization next year? Let's bring in three MPs to debate that. Liberal MP Bill Blair is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice as the government's point man on reforming marijuana laws. Michael Cooper is the Justice Critic for the official opposition Conservatives. And Murray Rankin is the Justice Critic for the NDP. Mr. Rankin, if I can, let me start with you since it's the NDP's motion the House was debating today. Why do you believe the government needs to decriminalize marijuana possession now?
Because, Peter, a lot of Canadians, particularly younger adult Canadians, are being charged all the time with marijuana in small quantities, an offence that will no longer exist as soon as we put together the strict regime that the government is properly trying to create. We're saying in the interim, until that's done, we don't think it's right for people to get criminal records and perhaps have a hard time getting a job or renting an apartment when that's known. And, of course, they can't travel to the United States. It affects people's lives to the tune of maybe 50,000 people in the next 2 years that'll have this record. The government's spending a lot of unnecessary money going after people, affecting their lives in a negative way for some activity that's going to be perfectly legal in 2 years' time. It just doesn't seem fair.
But a lot of justice-related laws do get changed, and yeah. You don't go back retroactively and change all the people who may have been prosecuted or not under the law.
Well, I'm not talking about retroactive. They can deal with I hope they will, with the people who, hundreds of thousands of Canadians who have records that should be expunged for what will be perfectly legal. But I'm talking about people who are getting charged and affected now. They have every ability under the federal legislation to do a directive, to tell the Crown to back off in the next while until we get our act together on marijuana.
All right, Mr. Blair, your government doesn't support the NDP motion. Why not? Why not decriminalize now ahead of legalization?
Well, first of all, I want to clarify something that Murray said. He said that next year, when the new regulations come in, that this activity will be perfectly legal. What is true is that when we bring in a new regulatory framework for the control of the production, distribution, and consumption of marijuana, it will be an activity that's highly regulated. And it'll be regulated in a way that enables us to achieve our public purposes, which is to protect our kids. Right now, Canadian youth have the highest rates of cannabis consumption anywhere in the world. And in addition, we know that organized crime profits in the billions of dollars from the illegal production and distribution of marijuana. And we want to have the opportunity to put in an effective and comprehensive regulatory framework. And so the activity that Murray refers to that will be legalized through our process of legalization, it's important to recognize that it will also be highly regulated, and through regulation it will enable us to keep our communities safe, protect our kids, and deal effectively with organized crime.
So will anybody being charged, let's fix your earpiece there. So will anybody being charged with simple possession of marijuana today be charged with simple possession of marijuana when the law is in place?
No. With the legalization of marijuana, then marijuana will be removed from Schedule 2 of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. But we will be replacing the control currently exercised through the criminal sanction with a strict public health framework of regulation. And until that strict framework is in place, we're not going to put our community... Well, and let me also be very clear.
Okay, but let me so what you're saying is, yes, it'll be legalized a year from now, but it'll be under much different circumstances than if you did it today.
Yeah,
that's the basic.
Well, and Peter, let me tell you that the evidence is overwhelming, and we've gone to the Centre of Addiction and Mental Health. We've consulted with experts in the field from the Canadian Centre for Substance Abuse. We've looked at the example of jurisdictions like Colorado and Washington who've gone through this, and overwhelmingly, the evidence tells us that we do not decriminalize and put in a half measure before you have properly established a responsible regulatory framework for the control of production, distribution, and consumption.
Mr. Cooper, where do the Conservatives stand on decriminalization now ahead of legalization?
Well, first, in terms of the NDP motion that is now before the House, we certainly think that it is helpful from the standpoint of furthering discussion around health and public safety issues surrounding marijuana. But the bigger issue is that the Prime Minister committed during the election to legalize marijuana. We're 8 months into the Liberal government, and they have yet to articulate exactly what that means. And we now know that it's not going to be until a full year from now that any sort of policy will come from this government. So as a result, municipalities, the provinces, law enforcement are left in a state of limbo as a result of the lack of leadership coming from this government. In fact, I mean, if you look at a place like Vancouver, for example, we now have more illegal marijuana dispensaries than Starbucks locations.
Mr. Rankin, what about to Mr. Blair's point that
well, it's funny, Peter.
Decriminalization won't happen now because when it's legalized, it will be under a very strict regime that wouldn't sort of have a Wild West of decriminalization today.
Well, we live in a Wild West now. You should come to Victoria. But look, I honestly believe that everything that Mr. Blair said in the long term about the need to create a robust regulatory regime and keep it away from our kids and getting it out of the hands of organized crime, I absolutely agree with and intend to work closely with him to make sure we get that right for Canadians. In the meantime, how do I answer that mother from Saskatoon who says that she heard our Prime Minister consume marijuana while a member of Parliament? Her son just got busted for marijuana. He's getting a criminal record. He can't get a job. And I'm saying, she says, isn't that unfair? What do I say?
Well, Mr. Blair, what should Mr. Rankin tell that constituent?
Well, what Mr. Rankin should do is exactly what we've all done, is encourage Canadians to obey the laws as they currently exist in Canada and to assure them. It's important to talk about what our government has promised. You know, we often hear from both parties, the other parties, that we're just going to legalize, and they leave out the rather important discussion around establishing that strict regulatory framework to control and restrict the access to kids that have the marijuana, to control the market so that organized crime no longer profits of it, and to assure Canadians' health. I will also tell you that, you know, the Commissioner of the RCMP has made it very clear that we shouldn't overstate the confusion. The law, as it pertains to marijuana prohibition, has been in effect in Canada for nearly a century, and I will tell you that police officers right across this country are exercising their discretion to ensure that the enforcement that they do is aimed towards public health. The numbers that Murray so often quotes are 3 years old.
Okay,
well,
that's
because of the
60
latest stats we have. And what can we do? We can't make it up. That's the numbers Stats Canada gave us.
Those stats are that 60,000 people could be charged this year, and 22,000 could end up with a criminal record.
Well, is that right? Peter, if I may, as you know, I'm from Toronto.
Yeah, and a former police chief.
And a former police chief, and I've looked at the number of charges laid under Section 4.1 of Schedule 2 of the CDSA, and there has been a 77.3 reduction in the number of charges laid in Toronto.
What does that mean? What does that say to you?
Well, what it says to me is that police officers are exercising their discretion. They're still enforcing the law. The law is still in effect, but that they are dedicating their time and their resources to matters of greater public safety.
That is so misleading. Okay. We have people in Saskatoon and Kelowna that are getting charged at 10 times the rate, 20 times the rate of other communities in Canada. We're still one country. It's a federal law. It's been applying so unevenly across the country. We've got to fix that.
And I would urge all Canadians to obey that law.
Mr. Cooper, should a young person today with simple possession of marijuana be facing a criminal charge?
Well, look, I think there certainly is incoherence in terms of the policy from this government, but I cannot support the NDP motion as worded to immediately decriminalize. I think in a lot of ways what this would do is make a bad situation worse in the sense that if we were to immediately decriminalize, the effect of that would be for the Minister of Justice to issue a directive in which there would be no enforcement, no age limit. I think there would be a proliferation of a commercialization of marijuana without the opportunity to impose further regulatory controls. What we as a party support is looking at ticketing, giving law enforcement agencies the opportunity to ticket instead of lay criminal charges. What we need to do is ensure that law enforcement has the tools that they need to combat illegal drugs and the detrimental impact it has on Canadians, particularly young Canadians, and to reduce the volume of judicial proceedings. And we believe that the ticketing option is a way to do that.
Mr. Blair, if police forces are, if police officers are using their own discretion to decide when to charge, when are they doing that? And if they're deciding to let some simple possession off the hook, why not let it all off the hook?
Well, police officers exercise their discretion to enforce the laws and maintain public safety every day. That's the way the Canadian criminal law works. In addition, our prosecutors exercise discretion and our judges exercise discretion.
I understand that, but it's not always in the case of where the government has a stated objective of decriminalizing or legalizing a certain activity.
Well, and again, Peter, I would just ask you to finish the sentence. Our objective is to legalize and replace the criminal sanction with a responsible, comprehensive system of regulatory control so that we can control who produces it, how it's produced, so that we can be able to assure Canadians of its potency and its purity and its safety, to make sure that we have regulations in place so that kids don't get access to it, and to make sure that organized crime doesn't profit from it.
Mr. Rankin, what's wrong with that approach, saying we're going to replace it with a better system, but it's a comprehensive system, and in the absence of that, you can't just say go ahead and do what you want to do till that system's in place.
I totally agree with the need for that comprehensive system, and I want to work with Mr. Blair to make sure we get it right for Canadians, all in favor. But in the meantime, people's lives are being destroyed by this in many cases, and it's just not fair. Until the government gets it together, why we cannot put a directive together with all the specifics that could make sure that we target it properly. It's not right for an Indigenous kid in downtown Saskatoon to be charged routinely, and in my community, nobody gets charged. Is that fair?
Okay, quickly, I want to hear from you in the 45 seconds or so we have left. Should there be an amnesty as part of the program, Mr. Blair, then Mr. Cooper? Should there be an amnesty for anybody who has been convicted of marijuana possession, let's say this year, simple possession, when that new regime comes into place, Mr. Blair, would the government look at an amnesty for those people?
Quite frankly, the law should be obeyed. And recognizing that yes, there are social harms of people getting a criminal record, and that's why I encourage them to obey the law. But there are many other harms associated to marijuana that this would exacerbate and make far worse in our communities.
Mr. Cooper, where do you stand on the notion of an amnesty?
Well, I think the first step is to see where the government is going to go, and all we know is that they're talking broadly about legalization. The devil is in the details. So let's get to step one before looking at other steps.
And Mr. Rankin, presumably you favor an amnesty. You've hinted at that.
Yeah, people who have criminal records, hundreds of thousands of them, should be expunged for an activity the government is about to make legal.
All right, gentlemen, thank you all for your time tonight. We'll continue to follow the process of this move towards legalization and all the other stuff it entails, but thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.